What's your favorite game series? Mine is The Legend of Zelda. The epic stories, the challenging puzzles, the music, the characters, really everything about it is just awesome and epic, despite the early commercials for it.
It's the Legend of Zelda and it's really rad. Those creatures from Ganon are pretty bad. Octoroks, Tektites, levers too. But with your help, our hero pulls through. Yeah, go Link, yeah, get Zelda. Awesome. Intense.
So naturally, when I heard Nintendo was releasing Skyward Sword HD, I was super excited. I love Skyward Sword on the Wii, and I always thought it was a bit underrated. Well, now it's here on Nintendo Switch, so in addition to taking a look at the changes from the Wii version, I want to take a look at the game as a whole, so people who never played the original can know what this game is all about. Development on The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword began in 2006, shortly after the completion of The Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess. Produced by the legendary Eiji Aonuma, Skyward Sword was intended to be the beginning of a departure from the traditional 3D Zelda formula, and the game ultimately laid the foundation for the big changes in the series we saw with the release of Breath of the Wild. The development team attempted to learn from the mistakes of Twilight Princess, such as how the overworld was too big and empty. Development took many years as the team were redesigning many aspects of the series, including the controls. Just as how Twilight Princess on the Wii took advantage of the Wii's unique controller to make an experience that was more immersive than traditional controls, Skyward Sword would take advantage of a relatively new WiiMotion Plus technology. WiiMotion Plus was an adapter for the Wiimote that added a gyroscope to the controller, something that many people thought the controller already had. There were also some controllers released that came with WiiMotion Plus built in. The Zelda team decided to take advantage of this updated controller to create a Zelda game with one-to-one movement between the controller and Link's sword, allowing for an experience that was supposed to be more immersive than any Zelda game before. As revolutionary as this control scheme was, it would also draw a lot of criticism. This started back at Nintendo's E3 2010 presentation, when Shigeru Miyamoto, creator of The Legend of Zelda, famously had a really hard time controlling the sword during a live demo, meant to show off just how immersive the controls would make the game. This, along with the linearity of the game and a few other aspects, has turned Skyward Sword into generally the least enjoyed of the 3D Zelda games. This game tells the earliest story in the Zelda timeline. Long before the events of the game, during the era of the goddess Hylia, evil forces sought to control the ultimate power left behind by the three golden goddesses. That power was the Triforce, left in the care of the goddess Hylia. A fierce war erupted, prompting Hylia to gather the humans in one area and send that chunk of Earth skyward, far above the clouds. Then Hylia, gravely wounded from the fighting, sealed away the source of the evil. The humans on the chunk of Earth in the sky became a skyfaring people, and that chunk of rock became their home, Skyloft. These people tamed giant birds called Loftwings, and the Loftwings and humans lived in a harmonious, symbiotic relationship for many years. When we meet Link long after these events, he's a student at Skyloft's Knight Academy. It's the day of the wing ceremony, a race which is an important step in becoming a knight, sorta like a final exam. As part of the ceremony, Link's childhood friend Zelda is playing the part of the goddess, and she'll present the winner with a handmade sailcloth. When Link wins the race, he and Zelda celebrate by going flying together on their Loftwings. Suddenly, a large black tornado knocks Zelda off her Loftwing, and Link attempts to go after her but is blown away and knocked unconscious. When he comes to, he's back in his bed at the Knight Academy. He then follows a mysterious spirit called Fi to a hidden chamber in Skyloft where the goddess's sword resides. After drawing the sword, Link learns that he has a major role to play in a great mission to save the world, as the goddess's chosen hero. He is to travel to the surface, a place no one in Skyloft's living memory has visited, defeat evil, and save Zelda. The next morning, Link dons his new green knight's tunic and begins his search for Zelda in the vast world beneath the clouds. Now, obviously there's more to the story as the game progresses, but I'll leave that for you to discover as you play. But I have to say, this is probably my favorite story in the series. It's really in-depth and it really draws the player in. And it can be very emotional, and it's really awesome to see Link's transformation from a young knight into the goddess's chosen hero. A big part of this game is telling the story of the origin of the legendary Master Sword, the Blade of Evil's Bane. In the second main part of the story, Link travels to Faron, Lanayru, and Eldin to temper the goddess's sword with 3 sacred flames. The sword grows more powerful and, with the blessing of the goddess, becomes the Master Sword. This is probably my favorite part of this game's story, as it's really cool to learn the origin of the sword that's been a huge part of the series ever since the third game. Something that can either make or break a story is the cast of characters, and this is an area where Skyward Sword excels. There are many great relationships between all the characters, and most of the NPCs in this game are actually memorable. Of course, we have Zelda, who in this game is not actually a princess. Instead, she is the daughter of the headmaster of the Knight Academy. She's Link's close childhood friend, and unlike in some other games in the series, Zelda has a really major part in this story, and she shows up over and over to remind you what you're fighting for. We even learn that she's actually the reincarnation of the goddess Hylia, which is what makes the Hyrule royal family, specifically its princesses, so special. I'd have to say, besides in Spirit Tracks, this is my favorite incarnation of Zelda we've seen. One of the other really important NPCs is Groose. Groose is your rival at the Knight Academy, and he's really jealous of how close Link and Zelda are. Though he is one of the most dynamic side characters I've seen in any game I've ever played, as throughout the story he turns from your bumbling rival into one of your best allies. And his theme song is really great. We even get to see Impa, a Sheikah tasked with protecting Zelda. This is the most epic Impa we've ever seen, perhaps with the exception of Age of Calamity. Though, while it was cool to see Impa, it left me wanting more. We still don't get an origin story for the Sheikah. Was Impa living on the surface this whole time? Are there more Sheikah? We don't know. Maybe if we get a prequel to this game we can finally find out. And of course, no game is complete without a great villain, and we get a really good one here, Girahim. Girahim is a self-proclaimed demon lord and is one of the weirdest, most extravagant characters in the series, and that's saying something. He seems to have some anger issues, but tries to maintain calm. But we can see his calm slowly dissolve as Link repeatedly thwarts his plans. And unlike some villains who really only show up at the end of a game, Girahim has little moments of interaction with Link throughout a large part of the story, so by the end of the game you know him very well. Alright, while we're talking about characters, we really need to talk about one of the most annoying aspects of this game on the Wii. Fi. Fi is the spirit that lives in your sword. She's a guide and a companion for the hero created by the goddess. Now, in Twilight Princess, your companion Minda was great, offering advice at times and being a big part of the story so that you would actually learn about her and grow to love the character. And she had a very fun, sassy personality, which was awesome. Fi is completely different. At least in the Wii version of the game, she would constantly interrupt the gameplay with useless dialogue. It may have been just to make observations about the world around you, or restate the exact description you just read for an item you got, or she'd complain if the batteries in your controller were running low. That alone is bad enough, but you have basically no emotional connection to her at all. She's intentionally a very robotic character, so she's very flat and boring. Though I won't lie, as much as I didn't like her in this game, I teared up a bit when the Master Sword glowed and her sound effect played in Breath of the Wild. So really, as both a character and a companion, Fi failed in the Wii, but she has been improved in the Switch release. Most of her interruptions are optional. If you reach a point where she would have interrupted you on the Wii, you usually have the option to hear what she has to say, or you can just ignore her. Now this is a huge improvement, but they still didn't really give her any personality or make her interesting at all, so she's still pretty terrible. Alright, so let's address one of the most controversial aspects of this game, the controls. As I mentioned earlier, the Wii version of the game utilized the advanced WiiMotion Plus. This added a gyroscope to the Wiimote, allowing for your movements with the Wiimote to translate directly to your sword in the game. And frankly, this was a really innovative and brilliant idea. It allowed for some creative puzzles and much more immersive combat. But the problem is, the WiiMotion Plus didn't always work great. Users sometimes had trouble making Link do what they wanted, and the controllers often needed to be recalibrated. This being the case, many people criticized the game because of the controls, and the game earned a bit of a bad reputation because of this. Now personally, I never really had a problem with the controls on the Wii version. Sure, I did occasionally have to recalibrate the controller, but overall my experience has been fairly positive. And I love swinging the Wiimote around like a sword. The size, shape, and weight of it made it perfect. Now sure, it would be better if there wasn't this wire here connecting to the nunchuck, but that's not really that big of an issue. Unfortunately, I can't really say the same thing about the Switch. Now, I know the Joy-Cons are supposed to be a lot more advanced than the Wiimote, and in some ways it did feel like they were working a bit better. But for anything involving the pointer, I was constantly having to recenter it on the screen. This immediately became annoying, and it was actually negatively affecting my enjoyment of the game. And I know this is just how the Joy-Cons are. I tried with both my Zelda Joy-Cons and my original gray ones with similar results. And I was experiencing something similar when I tried to play Super Mario Galaxy on the Switch. In that game, it was so frustrating that I rarely ever play it, despite the fact that I loved Mario Galaxy on the Wii. So I'm just gonna say that this is another flaw of the Joy-Cons. Besides that though, I don't really like using the Joy-Con as a sword as much as I did with the Wiimote. The Joy-Con's just too small and light, it just doesn't feel substantial to swing around. It's still fun, it's just not as fun. Though I will say, I am happy that Nintendo took advantage of the second analog stick to allow us to control the camera on this one. That's something you actually couldn't do on the original, and now that it's here, I realize just how annoying it was not to be able to control it on the Wii version. So, good job there, Nintendo. Now, Nintendo obviously wanted to improve the game for the Switch release, so they addressed people's complaints about the controls by adding a sort of button control scheme. And I say sort of, because you control the sword using the right analog stick. And it's fine. It's not great, as it is a little bit awkward, and frankly, I had a harder time using the button controls than I did using the motion controls. So for most of my playthrough, I just stuck to the motion controls, but it is still a nice option for people who don't want to swing their arms around as they play. So, in case you haven't noticed, this game is beautiful. The developers went with a sort of watercolor art style, which is kind of a mix between Twilight Princess and The Wind Waker. Even on the Wii, this still looks great. Everything's bright and colorful. And Nintendo did a pretty neat trick to make this game look good and still run well, even back on the Wii. While nearby objects are relatively crisp and clear, faraway objects look much more blurred. While this does fit the watercolor aesthetic, it had the added benefit of being easier to render on the screen as there's less detail, making the game run fairly smoothly on the Wii. Now, while the Wii version is still beautiful, the Switch version just completely blows it away. The same art style is maintained, but everything is much more crisp and clear as the game is displayed in 1080p as opposed to the Wii's max of 480p. Nintendo even maintained the trick of making faraway objects have less detail, but as the Switch is running at a higher resolution, there's still a significant amount of detail here as opposed to on the Wii. I don't really have anything bad to say about the graphics in either version of the game. It's absolutely beautiful, and these are my favorite graphics of any Zelda game. Part of what made Skyward Sword on the Wii so great was the amazing soundtrack. It was the first Zelda game to have a fully orchestrated soundtrack, and I have to say, every piece here is great and really fits where it's used in the game. The sky theme is epic and makes you excited to go on an adventure. The Skyloft theme is relaxing, which is perfect as this is where you go to rest and prepare for your adventure. And the dungeon themes all sound rather mysterious, which is fitting since you're exploring these ancient structures, not knowing what lies around the next corner. Now, the Zelda series has always had good music, but this soundtrack is one of the best in my opinion. There isn't a single bad track. And we even have one of my favorite Easter eggs in the series hidden in this game's main theme. So here's the Ballad of the Goddess, which is, by the way, very epic. Now here it is in reverse. Sound familiar? That's because the Ballad of the Goddess played in reverse is Zelda's Lullaby from A Link to the Past, though it's more commonly known from Ocarina of Time. I think it's just amazing that Zelda's Lullaby in reverse is this epic theme. This explains why the song was passed down by the royal family and has mystical powers, because it comes from a divine melody. Zelda's overworld design, in my opinion, isn't always the best. Sure, you get some fantastic overworlds like in Majora's Mask or Breath of the Wild, but then there are some like in Twilight Princess or The Wind Waker which in my opinion just fall short as they're too big and empty. Skyward Sword I feel falls somewhere in between. Its overworld is broken down into two parts, the sky and the surface. The sky is where you start out your adventure, and at first it seems to be pretty awesome. But then you realize that there's not really much to do outside Skyloft. It's big and open with very little of interest, just like the Great Sea in The Wind Waker. The surface, however, is a bit better. There's generally more to see and it's a lot more exciting. However, it's also very guided and linear. If you look at something like Breath of the Wild, there's a lot to do and see in the overworld, and you can do whatever you want whenever you want. But in Skyward Sword, a lot of what you can do on the surface is based on where you are in the story. Large portions of the surface are off limits until you progressed far enough, either by requiring an item or just having the area blocked off. This leads to a situation where, when you're on the surface, you just want to follow the path laid out for you in order to progress through the story, and there's really no sense of exploration since you're just doing what you have to do. And that's one of the biggest problems with this game, the linearity. Now, there does come a time where you have some choice of what you want to do next, but it comes late in the game, so you've already experienced most of what the game has to offer. But still, I guess it's better than nothing. Zelda has for the most part always had some really cool dungeons, and this game is no exception. While they are sometimes fairly simple and linear, Skyward Sword's dungeons are still in my opinion some of the best in the series. They have some fairly interesting puzzles and are all mostly intuitive. I especially love the ancient cistern with how the top side is bright and beautiful and how underneath there's a dark and dangerous underworld. But as I mentioned, the puzzles are pretty good. Some require you to move your sword in a certain way, or maybe you have to find the order to slash at the quadrants on the lock. Even the puzzles that don't involve your sword are great. Some may test your spatial reasoning skills or will require the use of another item. Like here, this door is blocked, but we can use our newly acquired beetle to fly out of the chamber and hit the switch to open the door. Really, all the puzzles in this game are just great. Now, the bosses for these dungeons aren't great. Some are good, like Galactos in the Ancient Cistern. This is a giant ancient automaton who attacks you with giant blades. In the second half of the fight, you even pick up his giant swords and start slashing away at him. It's so much fun. Or Girahim. You fight him at the end of 2 different dungeons, and these fights are hard and awesome. You have to duel him with your sword, watching for an opening where he won't just deflect your attack. These are some really hard fights, and it feels really awesome when you actually beat him. But then you have some bosses like Scaldera, who's just too easy, and then there's Tantalus, who's one of the worst designed bosses in the series. Like, look at this thing, it looks like something out of Monsters Inc. And it's not scary at all. And it's a shame, it's a really bad boss at the end of one of the best dungeons ever, the Sand Ship. Now, for the most part, fighting these bosses follows the traditional formula. Use the dungeon item in some way, then slash at the boss's obvious weak spot, usually an eye, with your sword. So I guess it's no wonder that the bosses I like the best are the different ones like Galactos or Girahim. Alright, so while we're talking about bosses, we have to talk about the Imprisoned. This giant monster is trapped at the sealed grounds, but at certain points in the story he breaks free and you have to fight him. And these fights are just not good. The first time, he's basically just a slug with legs and he slowly makes his way up to the sealed temple. You have to either slash his toes to make him fall or jump on his head from above. Then you use your sword to smash the big spike back into his head. Do that 3 times and you win. Then the second time he breaks free, he has arms. Ooh, scary. This fight is basically the same as the first one, except now sometimes he'll try to climb the wall. But you also have Bruce helping this time. He built a contraption around the pit that flings bombs at the imprisoned. Using this, the fight is just as easy as the first one. Now the third fight is a little different. The imprisoned will grow a halo and begin to fly out of the pit. Hitting him with Bruce's machine will cause him to fall, but also trigger an earthquake which blocks Bruce's supply of bombs. So instead, Bruce decides to fling you with the machine onto the imprisoned's head to hit the spike. So in theory, this could be a good boss, but it just isn't. Maybe if it were just the third phase it'd be fine, but fighting him 3 times is repetitive and tedious. The end of the game is amazing. You rescue Zelda and are celebrating with her, Bruce, and this old lady at the sealed grounds who you've since learned is Impa, when suddenly there's a bright flash of magic and you hear the distinctive laugh of Girahim. He grabs Zelda and runs through the open gate of time to the distant past. Being the hero that he is, Link quickly follows. In the past, Girahim is trying to use Zelda's soul to revive his master, who happens to be trapped in the monstrous form of the imprisoned. Girahim, in an effort to prevent you from reaching him, spawns hordes of monsters to block your path. But you're on a mission, and you're determined. The Master Sword easily slices through countless enemies as you make your way down to Girahim. Once there, Girahim finally loses his temper and stops pretending to be a cool, collected villain. He transforms into a being very similar in appearance to Fi. You then fight him on floating platforms in an epic duel, knocking him down to the lower levels and stabbing him through the jewel on his chest. But it doesn't matter, his ritual is complete and his master is revived. The massive form of the imprisoned transforms into its true form, Demise. Demise is a large humanoid with flaming hair. This hulking beast reaches towards Girahim, who transforms into Demise's massive sword, which looks very similar to the Master Sword, though much more evil. Intrigued by Link's courage, Demise challenges him to a duel. You follow Demise through a portal to an alternate dimension where you engage in a really challenging sword duel with the source of all evil in Hyrule. After a long and challenging fight, Link flies through the air, catching a bolt of lightning on the blade of the Master Sword and plunges the blade deep into Demise's chest. With his final breaths, Demise places a curse where those with the blood of the goddess and the spirit of the hero will be cursed to eternally be reincarnated, along with an incarnation of Demise's hatred. And this is, in terms of lore, the most important part of this game. It sets up how all the games have the princess, the hero, and some powerful evil, and why similar events happen over and over for tens of thousands of years. In later games, Ganondorf is a reincarnation of Demise, and I think it's just awesome how with this one battle Nintendo tied the whole series together. Looking at this game as a whole, it really is just a fantastic adventure. Now, the linearity at certain parts, while kind of frustrating, really isn't the end of the world. Nintendo made this game to tell a story, and I think they did an excellent job with that. With the excellent dungeons, the characters, and the overall depth of the story, I feel this really is one of the best games in the series. Now, as for which version is better, I'm kind of having a hard time deciding. On the one hand, I feel the Wiimote just worked so much better than the Joy-Cons. But on the Switch version, we have significantly better graphics, and we can control the camera. So with that, and the many other minor tweaks they made here and there, I have to say I think the Switch version kind of is better, but don't get me wrong, the original, in my opinion, is still one of the best games on the Wii. So whether it's on the Wii or the Switch, if you haven't played this game, I highly recommend you give it a shot. I promise it'll be well worth your time. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please leave a like and consider subscribing. I'm curious, if you played this game on the Wii, has the Switch version changed your overall opinion on it? And if this is your first time playing, what are your thoughts on the game? Please let me know down in the comments. Well, until next time, so long!